For 70 years, a letter from the President of the United States to an allied leader was a symbol of unity, a reaffirmation of a shared vision for security and prosperity. It was the bedrock of the free world's economic order. But in July of 2025, that symbol was weaponized. Personal letters became instruments of economic coercion, threatening America's closest friends in Canada and Japan with crippling tariffs. The bluff was meant to force submission. Instead, it triggered a quiet rebellion. How did a series of threatening letters accidentally redraw the global trade map? To grasp the seismic shift of 2025, you have to understand the world that came before it. In the ashes of World War II, America built a new global order based on a simple bargain. In exchange for loyalty in the Cold War, its allies would get protected access to the world's largest market. This wasn't just idealism, it was a strategic masterstroke. Alliances with partners like Canada and Japan became three-dimensional, fusing military cooperation with deep economic integration. Supply chains became continental, then trans-Pacific. A car sold in California was built with steel from Ontario and electronics from Tokyo. This was the era of predictable, rules-based trade, a system that created unprecedented global wealth, with America firmly at its center. But the foundation began to crack long before the letters were sent. The America First doctrine signaled a profound change in philosophy. The U.S. began to view the system it created not as a strategic asset, but as a bad deal that had hollowed out its industrial base. The first major blow was America's withdrawal from the TPP, a massive trade pact designed to counter China's influence, which left allies like Japan and Canada scrambling. Then came the sporadic tariffs on steel and aluminum under the controversial Section 232 National Security Clause. These actions, while disruptive, were seen as warning shots. They introduced a dangerous new element into the alliance: unpredictability. For leaders in Ottawa and Tokyo, the writing was on the wall. The era of dependable partnership was ending. Relying on a single, increasingly volatile anchor was no longer a viable long-term strategy. The quiet work of building alternatives had already begun. The strategy that unfolded in July 2025 was unlike anything seen in modern diplomacy. It wasn't policy, it was a shakedown. On July 10th, a series of letters, personally signed by Donald Trump, were dispatched to America's closest allies. As reported by Reuters and Politico, the message to Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney was blunt. A 35% tariff on all Canadian goods would be imposed on August 1st. There was no economic analysis, no public hearing, no diplomatic preamble. It was a raw ultimatum. Simultaneously, similar letters reached Japan and 13 other Asian nations, threatening punishing tariffs if new trade deals weren't reached by the same deadline. These weren't official policy documents born from interagency review. They were written in the language of personal relationships, using phrases like "our relationship," yet delivered with the force of a threat. The administration internally branded them the Liberation Day tariffs, a name dripping with political theater. The goal was to create a crisis, a short, sharp shock designed to force allies to the negotiating table just weeks before the G20 summit. This would create a string of wins that could be touted on the campaign trail. The legal justification was, once again, the obscure but powerful Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act. This law allows a president to unilaterally impose tariffs by declaring certain imports a threat to national security. It was originally intended as a last resort against Cold War adversaries. Under Trump, it was transformed into a primary tool of economic statecraft, a cudgel to be used against friends and foes alike. By invoking national security, the administration could bypass the messy, transparent process of normal trade negotiations. It was a strategy of coercion, not consensus. The underlying belief was that America's economic power was so overwhelming and its allies' dependence so complete that they would have no choice but to capitulate. They believed Canada's economy would collapse without the U.S. market, and that Japan's fear of auto tariffs would force them to concede on everything. It was a high-stakes gamble based on a single, flawed assumption that America's allies had no other options. They were about to be proven spectacularly wrong. The reactions in Ottawa and Tokyo were a study in contrast, yet perfectly synchronized in their strategic objective: to call Trump's bluff by refusing to play his game. Canada chose the path of quiet defiance. There were no angry press conferences or public retaliations. Instead, as reported by Bloomberg and the Atlantic Council, Prime Minister Carney's government initiated a swift and silent pivot. They immediately accelerated free trade agreement (FTA) negotiations with ASEAN, a rapidly growing economic bloc of over 650 million people. Simultaneously, they launched a global marketing blitz for their most valuable assets, pitching Canadian LNG and strategic minerals like cobalt, nickel, and lithium, the building blocks of the green economy, directly to new partners in Asia and Europe. The strategy was to not engage in Trump's reality show, but to simply change the channel, building new economic networks that bypassed the United States entirely. PM Carney's statement that Canada remained a strategic partner with China, even while negotiating with Washington, was a masterstroke of diplomatic ambiguity, signaling that Ottawa would no longer put all its eggs in the American basket. Japan, on the other hand, adopted a two-pronged approach. Publicly, their condemnation was swift and sharp. The Minister of Trade, as per the Washington Post, called the threat an abuse of national security provisions, a direct challenge to the legitimacy of Trump's actions. But behind the scenes, their actions mirrored Canada's. They doubled down on their own network building. Tokyo intensified talks to strengthen its existing trade pacts with the EU and ASEAN, while also working to expand Pan-Asian agreements like the CPTPP, the very deal Trump had abandoned. This created a powerful defensive moat, making the Japanese economy more resilient. While still engaging in tense, back-channel negotiations to avert the threatened 25% auto tariffs, they were systematically reducing their reliance on the American market. As noted by Reuters, this was also driven by domestic political pressure, as Prime Minister Ishiba faced an upcoming election and could not afford to be seen as buckling to American threats. Together, Canada and Japan weren't just pushing back, they were leading a quiet restructuring of global trade, demonstrating to the world that there was life after American leadership. This coordinated yet independent pivot created an immediate and profound dilemma, not for the Allies, but for the United States. Trump's strategy was designed to isolate his targets and force them into one-on-one concessions. It backfired, uniting them in common cause. The White House was now trapped. If it proceeded with the tariffs on August 1st, it would inflict real pain on American consumers through higher prices, harm its own industries, and likely trigger a global recession, for which it would be blamed. Yet, if it backed down and withdrew the threats, it would be a humiliating public defeat. It would signal to the world that the Liberation Day ultimatum was a failed bluff, emboldening other countries and weakening America's negotiating position for the future. The weapon of unpredictability, once so effective, had been neutralized by the quiet confidence of allies who had spent years preparing for this exact moment. The U.S. was left in a standoff of its own making, facing a choice between economic self-harm and political humiliation, while its allies calmly continued to build a world that no longer revolved around them. For America's allies, the cost was not one of submission, but of acceleration. Trump's threats acted as a catalyst, forcing them to turn long-term diversification plans into immediate, urgent action. In Canada, the shift was tangible. The country began a massive push to reorient its energy and resource sectors away from the U.S. The goal was to become a direct energy superpower to Asia. As reported by Bloomberg, projections showed Canadian LNG exports, primarily flowing to Asia, were now on track to increase by a staggering 30% by 2026. This represents a permanent rerouting of energy supplies that would have otherwise gone to or through the United States. Similarly, Canada began marketing its vast reserves of critical minerals, cobalt, lithium, nickel, directly to European and Asian battery and EV manufacturers, positioning itself as the key non-Chinese supplier in the clean energy transition. While this pivot involves enormous logistical challenges and upfront investment, it offers the promise of long-term stability, free from the political whims of Washington. The end result is a more resilient and independent Canadian economy, but one that is structurally less integrated with its southern neighbor. The threat didn't break Canada, it forced it to build new foundations. In Japan, the impact was a deepening of its multi-layered trade network strategy. The American threat solidified the consensus that economic security depended on having a portfolio of partners. According to analysis from institutions like Brookings and the Lowy Institute, Japan's renewed focus on its FTA with ASEAN was projected to boost their two-way trade by 25% by 2025. This isn't just about selling more cars. It's about deeply integrating supply chains in everything from digital services to advanced manufacturing, creating a powerful economic bloc in Asia with Japan as a key hub. The crisis pushed Japan to become a more proactive leader in regional trade, championing the rules-based order that the U.S. appeared to be abandoning. The cost for Japan was the final realization that the post-war American security and economic umbrella could no longer be taken for granted, forcing a more independent and assertive foreign policy. Back in the United States, the blowback from the tariff threats was immediate and measurable, felt not by foreign governments, but by American businesses and families. The very threat of massive supply chain disruptions sent shockwaves through the economy. As global growth fears mounted, the price of oil fell, but any benefit was erased by domestic inflation. The June ISM report painted a grim picture. Inflation remained stubbornly high at 2.7%. Driven largely by the rising cost of input materials for manufacturers, a direct consequence of existing and threatened tariffs. The pain was acute in the corporate world. A devastating report from KPMG revealed that 60% of American businesses had seen their profit margins shrink due to trade policy, with a quarter of them reporting a significant drop of over 10%. This wasn't theoretical. This was lost revenue, canceled investments, and hiring freezes. The ultimate cost of the Allies' pivot could be enormous. Analysis suggested the rerouting of Canadian energy and Japanese trade could eventually strip an estimated $12 billion in annual export-related revenue from the U.S. economy. That's a direct hit to American workers and companies in the energy, logistics, and manufacturing sectors. The strategy designed to project strength was instead creating tangible economic weakness at home, forcing Americans to pay the price for a political gambit that was failing on the world stage. And so, North America stands at a crossroads it never anticipated. A relationship once defined by absolute trust is now fractured by the weaponization of trade. The United States, in an attempt to reassert its dominance, instead accelerated the creation of a multipolar economic world where its allies are now its competitors. Canada and Japan, pushed to the brink, discovered their own power and forged new alliances of alternatives. The old simple certainties are gone, replaced by a new, uncertain reality where the cost of going it alone is dangerously high. In the race to define the future, will North America win together, or will both sides lose trying to go it alone? Are you American or Canadian? Share your story and your perspective in the comments below.